Eddie Whitaker was an ordinary man, living an ordinary life in the sleepy town of Briarwood. He was a single father, raising his teenage daughter, Julia, and running a small carpentry business that kept him busy and content. Everything was normal, mundane, even, until he got the call. It was a chilly November afternoon when the phone rang, the sound breaking through the rhythmic tapping of Eddie's hammer in the workshop. He wiped his hands on his apron and answered the phone, expecting a customer or a friend. Instead, it was a voice from his past. "Hello, Eddie." The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and unmistakably familiar. "Rick?" Eddie's heart sank as memories from a distant past flooded back. He hadn't spoken to Rick Hughes in over 15 years, not since the incident. The incident that had shattered their friendship and changed their lives forever. "Eddie, I need your help," Rick said, his voice trembling. "It's about Jessica." Jessica, the name sent a shiver down Eddie's spine. Jessica was the girl who had vanished all those years ago. The girl they had both loved and lost. The girl whose disappearance had torn their town apart and left unanswered questions lingering in the air like a curse. "What about her?" Eddie asked, his voice tight with unease. "I think she's back," Rick whispered. "I saw her, Eddie. I swear I saw her." Eddie's mind raced as he listened to Rick's story. He spoke of seeing Jessica near the old cabin, the place where they had spent endless summer days together, the place where they had last seen her before she vanished. Eddie's stomach churned with a mix of disbelief and dread. How could she be back? She hadn't aged a day since they last saw her. Briarwood was a small town where secrets were as common as the autumn leaves that littered the streets. Jessica Fielding's disappearance had been the town's biggest secret, a mystery that had haunted its residents for over a decade. Eddie met Rick at the old diner, where they had spent countless nights during their high school years. The place hadn't changed much. The same chipped countertops, the same flickering neon sign, and the same waitress, Betty, who would serve them greasy fries and sodas back in the day. "You look like hell," Eddie said, eyeing Rick's disheveled appearance. Rick had always been the cool, charismatic one, but now he looked haunted, his eyes shadowed and his face gaunt. "I saw her, Eddie," Rick repeated, his voice shaking. "Last night, near the old cabin. She looked exactly the same." Eddie's blood ran cold. The old cabin had been their hideout, a place where they had spent endless summer days. It was also the last place they had seen Jessica before she vanished. "This is crazy," Eddie said, shaking his head. "Jessica's gone, Rick. She's been gone for 15 years. "I know what I saw," Rick insisted, his voice desperate. "You have to believe me, Eddie. We need to find her." Against his better judgment, Eddie agreed. The old fears and memories resurfaced, and he couldn't shake the feeling of unfinished business. They set out that night, the autumn air cold and filled with the scent of decaying leaves. The cabin was hidden deep in the woods, forgotten and decaying like a memory best left undisturbed. As they approached, Eddie felt a familiar unease settle over him. The cabin was dark, the windows boarded up, but as they drew closer, a faint light flickered inside. "She's here," Rick whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. The cabin was just as Eddie remembered it. A rickety wooden structure, leaning precariously against the backdrop of the dense forest. The memories of the last time he had been there came flooding back, the laughter, the promises, and then the screams. The memory of Jessica's terrified face haunted him as he pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the cabin was cold and dark, illuminated only by the flickering light of a small candle. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. Rick stepped inside, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting Jessica to appear at any moment. "Jessica?" Rick called out, his voice echoing through the empty cabin. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, A faint rustling sound came from the corner of the room. Eddie turned and saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a girl, her long hair tangled and her eyes wide with fear. "It's her," Rick whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Eddie's heart pounded as he stared at the girl. She looked just like Jessica, but it couldn't be her. She hadn't aged a day since the last time he had seen her. "Jessica?" Eddie asked, his voice trembling. The girl stared at them with haunted eyes. "You need to leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're coming." Before Eddie could react, the door burst open, and a group of masked men stormed into the cabin. They grabbed Rick and Eddie, forcing them to the ground. Eddie struggled, but the men were strong and determined. As he was dragged out of the cabin, he saw the girl being taken away, her terrified eyes meeting his for a brief, fleeting moment before she disappeared into the darkness. Eddie and Rick were blindfolded and dragged through the woods. The chill of the night air seeped through their clothes, and the only sound they could hear was the crunching of leaves beneath the boots of their captors. When the blindfolds were removed, they found themselves in a dark, damp underground chamber. The air was cold and smelled of earth and decay. "Where are we?" Eddie asked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Welcome to the Whispering Cavern," a deep voice said, and Eddie turned to see a tall, imposing figure standing before him. The man's face was obscured by a mask, and his eyes glinted menacingly in the dim light. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice filled with a cold menace. "Jessica belongs to us now. Who are you?" Rick demanded, his voice filled with anger and fear. "We are the keepers of the secret," the man replied. "We protect the town from those who seek to uncover the truth." Eddie's heart pounded as he realized they were in deep trouble. The Whispering Cavern was an underground network of tunnels and chambers, a place filled with secrets and shadows. It was a place where people went to disappear. "You need to let us go," Eddie said, his voice trembling. "We won't tell anyone." The man laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "It's too late for that," he said. "You've seen too much." Eddie and Rick were thrown into a small chamber, and the door was locked behind them. The chamber was cold and dark, and the only light came from a small hole in the ceiling. "We need to get out of here," Rick said, his voice shaking. "We need to find Jessica." Eddie nodded, his mind racing. He knew they had to escape, but the Whispering Cavern was a maze of tunnels and chambers. He remembered exploring the tunnels as a kid, back when the cavern was just a place for adventure and fun. But now, it was a place of darkness and danger. Back in Briarwood, the town was buzzing with the news of Jessica's reappearance. Eddie, Rick, and Jessica were the talk of the town, and everyone wanted to know what had happened in the Whispering Cavern. But Eddie knew that their troubles were far from over. The masked man was still out there, and he knew too much about the town's secrets. He and Rick had uncovered a dark conspiracy, and they knew that the keepers of the secret would stop at nothing to silence them. "We need to go to the police," Rick said, his voice trembling with fear. "We can't," Eddie replied, his mind racing. "The keepers are everywhere. We can't trust anyone." They met with Jessica in the old diner, where they had spent so many nights in their youth. Jessica looked pale and haunted, her eyes filled with fear and confusion. "They took me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They took me to the cavern, and they wanted to make me one of them." "We won't let that happen," Eddie said, his voice filled with determination. But just as he spoke, the door of the diner burst open, and the masked man stormed in, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You can't escape us," he hissed, his voice filled with cold menace. "The truth must be protected." Eddie and Rick stood their ground, their hearts pounding with fear and anger. The man lunged at them, but they fought back, their fists flying. The diner was filled with chaos as they battled the man, the sounds of their struggle echoing through the night. Finally, they overpowered him, and the mask fell from his face, revealing the identity of the man behind the Whispering Cavern. It was Mayor Thompson, the man who had ruled Briarwood with an iron fist for decades. "You can't stop us," he hissed, his eyes gleaming with malice. "The truth will die with you." But Eddie knew that the truth had to be revealed. He and Rick went to the police, and the story of the Whispering Cavern was uncovered. The town was shocked by the revelations, and the keepers of the secret were dismantled. The truth about the Whispering Cavern sent shockwaves through Briarwood. Mayor Thompson and the keepers of the secret were arrested, and the town began to heal from the scars of the past. In the days following the revelations, the media descended upon Briarwood, turning the sleepy town into a frenzy of activity. Reporters hounded Eddie, Rick, and Jessica, eager for interviews and insights into the dark secrets that had been unearthed. Eddie found the attention overwhelming, but he knew it was necessary to shine a light on the horrors they had uncovered. Eddie, Rick, and Jessica tried to move on, but the memories of the cavern haunted them. They knew that they had faced a darkness that would never truly go away, but they were determined to move forward, to build new lives and leave the past behind. Eddie returned to his carpentry business, focusing on his daughter and his work. But every now and then, he would pause and stare into the distance, remembering the darkness they had faced and the secrets they had uncovered. Rick, too, struggled to adapt to life after the cavern. He had been the town's golden boy, destined for greatness, but the events of that night had shattered his confidence and left him haunted by guilt and fear. He moved to a new town, hoping for a fresh start, but the shadows of the past followed him, and he often woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and shaking with fear. Jessica sought therapy to cope with the trauma she had experienced. She had been a vibrant, happy girl before her disappearance, but now she was a shadow of her former self, haunted by the horrors she had faced in the Whispering Cavern. With the help of her therapist, she began to heal, slowly but surely, and she found solace in the company of her friends and family. But sometimes, late at night, Eddie would hear the faint sound of whispers echoing through the darkness. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, and he would remember the shadows and the fear they had faced in the Whispering Cavern. And he knew, deep down, that the shadows of the past would always linger, like ghosts haunting the edges of his mind. Years passed, and the memory of the Whispering Cavern faded into the annals of Briarwood's history. The town moved on, and new generations grew up, unaware of the dark secrets that had once plagued their quiet community. Eddie, Rick, and Jessica remained close, bound together by the shared trauma of their experience. They gathered every year on the anniversary of Jessica's disappearance, a silent tribute to the shadows they had faced and the truth they had uncovered. One crisp autumn evening, as Eddie sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the town, he heard a faint rustling sound in the distance. He tensed, his heart racing, but when he looked, he saw only the wind blowing through the trees. The shadows were gone, but the memory of the Whispering Cavern remained, a haunting reminder of the darkness that had once lurked beneath the surface of their quiet town. Eddie sighed and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes and letting the cool evening breeze wash over him. He knew that the past would always linger, like a shadow on the edge of his mind, but he also knew that he had faced the darkness and come out the other side. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace.